I raised my son for 31 years. 3 days after my husband and Apo's funeral, my son changed the locks on my own front door and handed me $20 folded into quarters, like he was tipping a waitress he and Apo's never see again. End quote. It and Apo's just until we sort out the will, Mom, end quote, Daniel said. He wooed and Apo's look at me. He looked at the doormat instead. The one that said welcome that Walter had bought at a hardware store in 1994, and that none of us had ever thought to replace. End quote. Vanessa thinks it and Apo's cleaner this way. No confusion about who and Apo's living where. End quote. Vanessa stood behind him in the doorway of the house I had scrubbed, painted, and buried 2 miscarriages and Apo's worth of grief inside of. She was wearing my dead husband and Apo's habit of crossing her arms when she wanted to look like she and Apo's already won an argument. End quote. We just think it and Apo's better if things are official, end quote, she said. End quote. For everyone and Apo's protection. End quote. I looked at the $20 bill in my hand. I looked at my son, who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on the 6 a.m. bus to his allergist, who I had once driven 4 hours through a snowstorm to bring cough syrup to at college because he sounded scared on the phone. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not remind him whose name had been on that mortgage for 30 years before his father and Apo's whose overtime shifts at the plant had covered it during the 2 years Walter was between jobs. I said, end quote, all right, Daniel. End quote. Then I turned around, walked to the rental car I and Apo's been using since the funeral home returned my keys, and drove to a Motel 6 off Route 9, where I sat on the edge of a bed with a stiff floral bedspread and did the only thing that felt like mine anymore. I opened the small leather planner I always carried, the one Daniel and Vanessa assumed held grocery lists and Dr. and Apo's appointments, and I wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. Day 1. 10 years later, the wing of St. Aurelia and Apo's regional medical center that treats children with congenital heart conditions would bear my name. 10 years later, my son would stand outside a courtroom in a suit he could no longer really afford, waiting to hear whether he would go to prison. 10 years later, my granddaughter would call me every Sunday at 4:00 and Apo's clock without fail, and I would never again have to wonder whether anyone in my family loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with money. But that was 10 years away. That night, I was 63 years old, widowed for 72 hours, and carrying $20 and a garment bag of black funeral clothes. I want to tell you how I got there. Both endings. The Motel 6 and the wing with my name on it. It starts like most things in my life did, with a man who saw more in me than I saw in myself, and who left me something far more dangerous than money. He left me a secret. My name is Eleanor Marshvoss, and for 40 years almost nobody outside of one law office and one accountant knew what I actually was. I grew up the daughter of a mill foreman in a town so small it didn't end Apo's have a stoplight until 1979. I was good with numbers the way some children are good with music. It wasn't an Apo's a skill I practiced, it was a language I already spoke. I did the church bookkeeping at 14 because the treasurer and Apo's eyes had started to fail. I balanced my father and Apo's overtime slips against his paychecks and found, twice, that the mill had shorted him. Both times quietly without asking anyone and Apo's permission, I walked into the payroll office and got the money back. I met Walter Voss in 1971, when he was a shift supervisor with a business degree he wasn't an Apo's using and an idea he was too afraid to try. He wanted to open a small medical staffing agency, nurses, orderlies, home aides, matched to the understaffed rural clinics that the cities didn't and Apo's care about. He had the idea. He did not, in his own words, end quote, have the head for the money side of it, end quote. I did. We were married 8 months later. I remember the exact night he proposed the business to me, at our kitchen table in a rented duplex, spreading a legal pad covered in his cramped handwriting across the oilcloth. End quote. I keep seeing the same problem everywhere I go, end quote, he said. End quote. Little clinics out past the county line, understaffed, turning away patients because they can and Apo's find a nurse willing to drive that far for the pay they and Apo's re-offering. Meanwhile there and Apo's nurses in the city working double shifts because the hospitals there are overstaffed on paper and drowning in practice. Somebody just needs to be the bridge. Match the right nurse to the right clinic, take a fee for doing it. End quote. End quote. That and Oppos. S not a bad idea, end quote, I said and meant it. End quote. I Don and Oppos. T have the head for the money side of it though, end quote. He admitted. End quote. The contracts, the margins, figuring out what to actually charge without pricing ourselves out or giving it away. I was thinking I and Oppos. D bring on a partner eventually. Somebody who and Oppos. S good with numbers, end quote. I looked at him for a long moment across that oilcloth table, at a man who had just described, without realizing it, exactly the woman he and Oppos. D married 3 months earlier. End quote. You already did, end quote, I said. End quote. You just Haven and Oppos. T noticed yet that she does your family and Oppos. S taxes for fun. End quote. Walter laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him, and it would be another 6 years before either of us stopped being surprised, in small moments like that one, by how completely we and Oppos. D built something neither of us could have built alone. I kept the books for Voss Staffing Solutions out of our kitchen for 6 years before we had our first real office. I priced our contracts. I negotiated our first hospital partnership, sitting across from 3 men in a boardroom who assumed I was Walter and Oppos' secretary until I corrected the margin error on their proposed contract in my head, out loud in under 10 seconds. By 1994, Voss Staffing Solutions had become Voss Sterling Health Group, after we merged with a rehabilitation clinic chain owned by a widow named Grace Sterling, who became not just my business partner but the only real friend I had left standing by the time this story is over. By 2001, we owned 41 facilities across 3 states. By 2010, when Daniel was already grown, married, and settling into a comfortable mid-level job at a regional investment firm, Voss Sterling was worth more money than Daniel would make in 4 lifetimes. And almost nobody knew because Walter and I had made a decision together quietly, the year Daniel turned 25 and asked us for a, end quote, loan, end quote, to cover a boat he and Oppos, D already bought. End quote. He doesn't and Oppos, T need to know what we have, end quote, Walter said. End quote, not yet. Maybe not ever. I and Oppos. V watched what money does to people who didn't and Oppos. T build it. I Don and Oppos. T want to watch it happen to our son. End quote. So we built a wall. Grace Sterling and Oppos' law firm structured a trust that held my shares under my maiden name, Eleanor Marsh, filed through a holding company with a name so boring nobody ever looked twice, Aurelia Holdings, after the town where I was born. Walter and I lived modestly. Modest house, modest cars, a checking account with a balance that would embarrass no one and impress no one. We let our son believe his parents were comfortable, ordinary, careful people who had raised him well but had nothing extraordinary to give him. It worked exactly as we intended. Daniel grew into a competent, unremarkable man who worked hard, complained about his mortgage, and never once suspected that his mother could have paid off that mortgage in cash without noticing the dent in her accounts. It also worked exactly as Walter feared it might, in a different direction. Because a son raised to believe his parents have nothing does not learn to fear what they might lose. He learns instead that there is nothing left to protect. I should explain briefly what a trust actually is because it matters for everything that comes after, and because I and Oppos, V since learned most people, including for a long time my own son, only half understand it. A trust is simply a legal box. You put assets inside it, money, shares, property, and you name someone to control what happens to that box called a trustee. The trustee doesn't and Oppos. T have to be the person who benefits from the box. Often at ISN and Oppos T, a parent might put money in trust for a child, naming a bank as trustee until the child turns 25, so the child can and Oppos T spend it recklessly at 18. What most people Don and Oppos T understand is that a trust can just as easily run the other direction. A person can put nearly everything they own into a trust and remain its trustee themselves, meaning nothing changes day to day, they still make every decision, but the ownership on paper now belongs to the box, not to them personally. To anyone looking from the outside, checking public records, asking around, the person appears to own almost nothing. Everything real sits quietly inside the box, governed by rules only the trustee and the attorney who built it fully understand. That was Aurelia Holdings. That was the box Walter and I built together, and the reason nobody, not our accountant and Oppos' assistant, not our neighbors, not eventually even our own son, could look at our modest house and modest cars and see anything but a modest life, Walter died on a Tuesday in March of the heart failure we and Oppos. D known was coming for 2 years. I held his hand until the monitor went flat and the room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet only once. 3 days later, I was standing on my own porch with $20 in my hand. What Daniel did not know, what nobody but Grace Sterling knew, was that 4 years earlier, worried about exactly the situation I now found myself in, Walter had quietly restructured the trust one final time. He had made me its sole trustee. Not Daniel. Not a bank. Me. Every share of Voss Sterling Health Group, every dollar in Aurelia Holdings, sat entirely under my control, invisible, untouched, waiting. I didn't and Oppos. Know yet how much I would need it. I only knew, standing in the Motel 6 parking lot with the cold coming through my thin funeral coat, that I was not as poor as my son believed. I was simply patient. I did not fight for the house. That surprised people later when they heard the story. Why didn't an Oppos? You just tell him who you were? Why didn't an Oppos? You call a lawyer that first week? Here is what I understood, sitting on that stiff motel bedspread. If I revealed the truth too early, Daniel and Vanessa would not become kind. They would become hungry. I had watched what happened to families who came into money suddenly. Grace had seen it 100 times in her law practice. Sons who stopped speaking to mothers the moment an inheritance was confirmed. Siblings who sued each other over china cabinets. If I showed my hand while Daniel still believed contempt cost him nothing, contempt is exactly what I would keep receiving forever, dressed up as gratitude only when convenient. So I let him believe I was poor. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment on Larkspur Avenue with water stains on the ceiling and a landlord who smoked in the stairwell, and I paid the rent out of a checking account that held exactly what a retired woman married 40 years to a modest businessman might reasonably have. $11,000, my half of a savings account Walter and I had kept for emergencies and a small pension. My next-door neighbor at Larkspur was a woman named Odette Reyes, 68, a retired school cafeteria supervisor who took one look at my funeral black wardrobe and my careful economical grocery bags and decided, not unkindly, that I was exactly what I appeared to be. A widow who and Oppos. D landed somewhere lower than she and Oppos. D started, the way so many widows on that particular floor of that particular building had. First month and Oppos. Always the hardest Odette told me the week I moved in, handing me a casserole dish over the low fence between our patios without being asked. You get used to it faster than you think though. I did. Husband left me for a woman half my age and half my sense, took most of the furniture with him too, if you can believe the nerve. She studied me a moment. You and Oppos, I'll be all right. You and Oppos, we got that look. Careful people always land on their feet eventually, even when it doesn't and Oppos. Feel like it, I did not correct her. I let her believe for the better part of a year, that I was exactly the kind of woman she and Oppos. D decided I was, a widow scraping by, grateful for a casserole, careful with her grocery money because she had no choice but to be. Odette became, without either of us naming it that way, the closest thing to a daily friend I had during the loneliest stretch of that year. She walked with me to the pharmacy. She sat with me the night the guardianship petition was filed, when I couldn't and Oppos. Bring myself to call Grace with the news until morning, and simply let me cry into a cup of her too-strong coffee without asking a single question. I wasn't and Oppos. Ready to answer. I invited her to the gala. I watched her face, over the course of that evening, move through nearly every stage of disbelief a person can move through in one night, confusion when she saw me on stage, something close to hurt when the board chair said the words founder and majority owner, and finally, somewhere near the end of the evening when I found her by the dessert table and simply said, I should have told you sooner, Odette, I and Oppos. Am sorry, something that settled slowly into a kind of fierce, unoffended pride. You Don and Oppos. Owe me an apology, she said, gripping my hand hard. You owed yourself a year of being someone and Oppos' friend without your money getting in the way of it first. I understand that better than almost anybody. I just want you to know, casserole or no casserole, rich or poor, you were good company on that porch, Eleanor. That part was never the act. We still have coffee every Sunday morning before Sophie and Oppos. S40 and Oppos. Clock call, exactly as we did on Larkspur. Though these days it happens in my garden instead of a water-stained kitchen, and the coffee at my insistence is considerably better. Vanessa came by exactly once in the first month to drop off a box of Walter and Oppo's old sweater. She said she and quote, didn't and Oppo's tea have room for. End quote. She stood in my new doorway and looked at the water stain on the ceiling the way you and Oppo's look at a stray dog you were relieved was and Oppo's tea yours to feed. End quote. This is cozy, end quote, she said. End quote. It and Oppo's fine, end quote, I said. End quote. Daniel feels terrible about the house thing. He really does. It and Oppo's just with the market the way it is and Sophie and Oppo's tuition we just can't and Oppo's be carrying 2 properties. You understand. End quote. I did understand. I understood that, end quote, carrying 2 properties, end quote, meant they intended to sell the house Walter and I had lived in for 31 years and keep every dollar of it, and that no version of, end quote, we can and Oppo's be carrying 2 properties, end quote, had ever included the words we and Oppo's I'll split the proceeds with mom, or even we and Oppo's I'll make sure mom is comfortable first. End quote. Of course, end quote, I said. End quote. You do what you need to do. End quote. Vanessa smiled, relieved the way people smile when they and Oppo's braced for a fight and gotten a surrender instead. End quote. You and Oppo's being so mature about this, Eleanor. I know Daniel appreciates it. End quote. She left. I closed the door, sat down at my small kitchen table, and opened the leather planner. Day 34 I wrote. House listed Friday. Vanessa mentioned Sophie and Oppo's tuition as reason for sale. Check whether any of the proceeds are earmarked for granddaughter, or whether this is a story told to justify taking everything. I was not being mature. I was taking notes. 3 weeks later, the house I had lived in for 31 years sold for $410,000. I did not receive a dollar of it, nor was I offered one, nor did anyone in my family ever raise the subject with me again, as though the sale had simply happened to a house that had never been mine. I drove past it once the week after closing. There was a new mailbox. Someone had already torn out Walter and Oppo's rose bushes. I did not cry that time either. I went home to my apartment on Larkspur, called Grace Sterling, and said 4 words that would end up costing my son everything he thought he was protecting. End quote. I need you now. End quote. Before I tell you what Grace and I built together, I need to go back 6 months further than that phone call, to an afternoon I and Oppo's turned over in my mind more times than I can count. The afternoon the door first opened quietly on its own hinges, long before anyone knew there was anything behind it worth taking. It was 2 weeks after Walter and Oppo's funeral, before the locks, before the $20, when Daniel still had the decency to look like a man trying. He came by the house on a Wednesday with a box of Walter and Oppo's tax records and a laptop bag, and he found me at the kitchen table surrounded by the particular paperwork of a death, insurance forms, a pension transfer letter, a folder from the funeral home I hadn't and Oppo's been able to open yet. End quote. Mom, you look exhausted, end quote. He said, and it was true, and it was the kind of true that made me want to believe every soft thing he said after it. End quote. Let me help. Seriously. You shouldn't and Oppo's have to do all this alone. End quote. End quote. I and Oppo's done our bills for 40 years, Daniel. End quote. End quote. I know you have. But Dad handled all the official stuff, the accounts, the beneficiary changes, all of it. And I just think with everything hitting you at once, it and Oppo's helped to have someone else in Oppo's eyes on it. That and Oppo's all. Just eyes. End quote. I want to be honest about the version of myself sitting at that table. I was 63 years old and I had just watched a monitor go flat in a hospital room. I had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 11 days. And my son, my only child, was sitting across from me offering, in the gentlest voice I and Oppo's heard from him in years, to carry something heavy for a little while. I almost said yes to everything. I want you to understand that because I think it matters for what comes later. This was never a story about a woman who saw the trap coming from the very first day and simply refused to be caught in it. I nearly walked into it willingly, out of grief, out of love, out of the ordinary human wish to be taken care of by your own child, just once after 40 years of being the one who did the taking care. End quote. What would that even look like? End quote. I asked. End quote. You having eyes on it? End quote. Daniel opened the laptop bag and pulled out a folder, not, I noticed later, one he and Oppos assembled that afternoon, but one that already had tabs, already had forms printed and ready, the kind of preparation that doesn't and Oppos happen in the 2 hours between deciding to help your grieving mother and driving to her house. End quote. Vanessa actually put this together, end quote, he said. End quote. She and Oppos really good at this stuff. She does the finances for her mom too. It and Oppos just some basic authorization forms. Access to check the accounts, make sure nothing bounces, catch anything weird before it becomes a problem. You and Oppos still make every decision. We and Oppos just be able to see. End quote. I looked at the top form. I did not, that day, understand what I was looking at well enough to know it was the seed of the same durable power of attorney Daniel would formally request 4 months later. I only knew that something in my chest, some old careful instinct that had kept a company solvent for 40 years, sat up straight and paid attention. End quote. Let me sit with it, end quote, I said. End quote. I and Oppos am not signing anything today. Not because I don't and Oppos trust you, sweetheart. Because I don't and Oppos trust me right now to make a decision like this while I can barely remember to eat lunch. End quote. Daniel and Oppos faced it something complicated, disappointment mostly, but underneath it, for just a second, something sharper. Impatience, maybe. Or the particular frustration of a plan meeting an obstacle it hadn't and Oppos accounted for. End quote. Sure, end quote, he said. End quote. Of course. No rush. End quote. He left the folder on the table anyway. End quote. Just in case you change your mind before I come back, end quote, he said at the door. I did not sign it that week. I put the folder in a drawer and told myself I and Oppos deal with it once I could think clearly again. 3 days later, I came home from the pharmacy to find the locks changed. I and Oppos asked myself many times since whether that was punishment for my hesitation, or simply the plan accelerating on its own schedule regardless of what I and Oppos said. Grace much later would tell me she believed it was both, that Vanessa had never actually expected me to refuse, and that my refusal, small and gentle as it was, had convinced her I needed to be handled more forcefully than persuasion alone would manage. End quote. They didn't and Oppos need the folder anymore once they had the house, end quote, Grace said. End quote. Losing the house made you dependent. Dependent people sign things eventually. They were just wrong about how much I and Oppos already helped you build underneath that you didn't and Oppos even know you had. End quote. I think about that folder often, the version of my life where I was simply too tired that Wednesday afternoon to say let me sit with it, where grief made me sign instead of pause. I don't and Oppos know that woman. I and Oppos am grateful every day that I never had to become her. There is one more piece of that Wednesday afternoon I and Oppos never told anyone but Grace because it embarrasses me a little, even now. After Daniel left, I sat alone at the kitchen table for nearly an hour with that folder unopened in front of me, and I cried, not for Walter, not that time, but for the specific humiliating fear that I was about to become a burden to my own son. That the folder wasn't an Oppos a trap at all, but simply what happens to every woman my age eventually, whether her family means well or not. The slow surrender of the parts of your life you used to run yourself. I think that fear, more than any trust document, was the real thing Daniel and Vanessa were counting on. Not my ignorance. My exhaustion. It is so much easier to hand your life to someone else when you and Oppos retired enough to believe you no longer deserve to hold it. I did not hand it over. But I understand now exactly how close I came, and I no longer judge as harshly as I once did the other women I and Oppos since met through the Elder Protection Fund who did. Grace Sterling was 71 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and had been managing the legal architecture of Aurelia Holdings since before Daniel could read. She met me for lunch at a diner 2 towns over from Larkspur, somewhere no one from my old life would recognize either of us. End quote. You could end this in a phone call, Eleanor, end quote, she said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. End quote. One phone call to your son. You tell him who you are. The whole ugly situation resolves itself in an afternoon, end quote. End quote. It resolves the money problem, end quote, I said. End quote. It doesn't, and Oppos resolve the problem underneath the money problem. End quote. Grace looked at me for a long moment. End quote. You want to know if he and Oppos D have done any of this to a mother he thought was worth something, end quote. End quote. I already know the answer to that, end quote, I said. End quote. I want to know if he can become someone different. And I want and Oppos T find that out by making the temptation disappear. I and Oppos LL find it by seeing what he does when he thinks there and Oppos S nothing left to gain, end quote. Grace didn't and Oppos T loved the plan. She loved me though, and she had learned decades earlier that when Eleanor Voss decided to be patient about something, patience won. End quote. Fine, end quote, she said. End quote. But I want weekly check-ins. And Eleanor, if this turns dangerous, if they try anything with legal teeth, we stop playing chess and I file paperwork the same day. Promise me that. End quote. End quote. I promise. End quote. It took 4 months for the first legal tooth to show itself. Daniel called me on a Sunday, his voice warm in a way it hadn't and Oppos T been since before the funeral. End quote. Mom. Hey, Vanessa and I were talking and we feel bad honestly about how things went with the house. We want to help you get things organized. Bills, insurance, all of it. It and Oppos S a lot for anyone to manage alone. End quote. It was, in fact, not a lot. I managed a small pension, a modest checking account, and a storage unit. I had managed 41 medical facilities across 3 states without breaking a sweat. But I let the warmth in his voice sit in my chest for a moment before I answered, because some part of me, the part that was still just his mother, not a trustee, not a strategist, wanted so badly for it to be real. End quote. That and Oppos S kind of you, end quote, I said. End quote. We just think it and Oppos D be easier if I had power of attorney. Just for the boring stuff. Bills, insurance claims, that kind of thing. You wouldn't and Oppos T lose control of anything, Mom, it and Oppos S just, in case something happens. God forbid. Like with Dad. End quote. There it was. I want to be honest about this moment because it is the moment in this story that people ask about most later when they hear it told. How did you know? How did you know that afternoon on the phone that this was the beginning of something worse than losing a house? The answer is that I didn't and Oppos T entirely. Grief makes children behave strangely toward their surviving parents. Some of it is genuine fear dressed up clumsily. What I knew was smaller and colder than certainty. I knew that Daniel had asked for this document 6 months after abandoning me on my own porch with a folded $20 bill, and that nothing in the 6 months between those 2 events had suggested he and Oppos D developed new tenderness toward me. What had changed was not his heart. What had changed was his information. Vanessa, I would learn much later, had spent an afternoon going through boxes from the house sale and found an old brokerage statement from 1998. An account so small and so long since closed it wasn't and Oppos T even part of the trust, a relic from before Walter and I built the wall. It listed our home address as Voss Residence, Voss Staffing Solutions, EIN attached. She hadn't and Oppos T found the truth. She and Oppos D found a thread. And she had begun quietly to pull. End quote. Send me the papers, end quote, I told Daniel. End quote. I and Oppos Ella looked them over. End quote. I did not sign that week. I gave the document to Grace, who read it in 11 minutes and set it down on her desk with the particular stillness of a lawyer who has just found something worse than she expected. End quote. Eleanor, end quote, she said. End quote. This ISN and Oppos T a limited power of attorney for bill paying. This is a durable general power of attorney. Financial and healthcare both. If you sign this, your son has legal authority to act on your behalf in nearly every domain of your life, including, if it ever came to it, authority to consent to guardianship proceedings on your behalf. End quote. I sat very still. End quote. They and Oppos not asking to help you pay bills, Eleanor, end quote. Grace said quietly. End quote. They and Oppos asking for the legal right to become you. End quote. I did not. End quote. I found an old form online, similar to what you sent, end quote. I told him over the phone, my voice deliberately vague in the way a woman genuinely confused by paperwork might sound. End quote. I think I filled it out. I mailed something back to you, didn't and Oppos T I get the address right? End quote. I had, in fact, mailed him a blank, unsigned copy with a sticky note that said, for your records, E. Daniel, distracted, Assuming the best, filed it without reading it closely. Vanessa did not check either. Nobody in my family had ever imagined I might be capable of a small, deliberate deception, because nobody in my family had ever imagined I was capable of very much at all. That gap between what they assumed and what was true became the single most useful weapon I had. Grace and I built a simple system. Every document Daniel or Vanessa sent me, I forwarded to her before responding. Every phone call I wrote notes on immediately afterward, dated specific in the leather planner. Every check, every loan request, every visit logged. You understand what we and Oppos, rebuilding, Grace said 3 months into this. This ISN and Oppos. Just a paper trail for your protection anymore, Eleanor. If they escalate, and I think they will, this becomes evidence. I know what we and Oppos, rebuilding, I said. What Grace also began, quietly, without my full knowledge at first, was an internal reorganization at Voss Sterling Health Group. As sole trustee, I had ultimate authority over the board, though I exercised it so rarely that most of the current executives had never once spoken to me directly. Grace had served for years as my visible proxy, the general counsel and family representative for the Voss Trust, a title vague enough to raise no questions. There and Oppos, essay wing dedication coming up, Grace mentioned one afternoon almost offhand, the way she mentioned things that were never actually offhand. Saint Aurelia and Oppos as, the board wants to name the new pediatric cardiac unit, after a major benefactor. They and Oppos. V been asking me for 2 years whether the Voss family would consider having your name attached publicly, instead of staying anonymous. I and Oppos. V always told them no, per your wishes, I looked up from my coffee. Why are you telling me this now? Grace smiled, the small dry smile of a woman who had been 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room since 1975. Because I think eventually you and Oppos, going to want a stage, she said. And I think it and Oppos, worth having one ready. I didn't and Oppos. Understand yet what she meant. I understand it completely now. 8 months after Walter and Oppos' death, Vanessa called me. The first time she had called me directly ever in 10 years of marriage to my son. Eleanor. Hi. So, quick thing, we and Oppos. Redoing some estate cleanup, and I found some old paperwork with your name on it from a company called Aurelia Holdings. I think it might be from way back, maybe even from your dad and Oppos' side? I had a friend look into it, and apparently it and Oppos' still an active entity. ISN and Oppos. That wild? Do you remember anything about it? My stomach went cold, but my voice did not change. Oh, that old thing, I said. Your father-in-law set that up years ago for some tax purpose. I never understood it. Probably worth nothing. Walter was terrible with paperwork, he didn't and Oppos. Need anymore. Right, that and Oppos. What I figured, Vanessa said too quickly. Just curious. Anyway, we should get dinner soon. Daniel misses you. I hung up and called Grace within the minute. They hired someone, Grace said once I and Oppos, relayed the conversation. A friend who and Oppos, looked into it and Oppos doesn't and Oppos, run a corporate entity search for fun on a Tuesday, Eleanor. Someone paid for that. Probably a forensic accountant, or a private investigator working cheap. What do they know? Not much yet. Aurelia Holdings is airtight, the ownership structure behind it takes real digging to unwind, and I built it that way on purpose. But they know the name exists. And now they know it and Oppos' active. Grace paused. This is the part where things usually move fast, Eleanor. People don and Oppos. Hire investigators over a curiosity. They hire them because they and Oppos smelled money and they intend to find it. She was right. 3 weeks later, Daniel invited me to Sunday dinner for the first time since the funeral. I should have been suspicious of the warmth. I let myself want it anyway. Sophie was there, my granddaughter 17, and folded into herself the particular way teenagers get when the adults around them are performing a version of family that doesn't and oppose. Match what and oppose. Actually happening in the house. She hugged me hard at the door, longer than a polite hello required. End quote. I and oppose. We missed you, Grandma, end quote, she whispered. End quote. Nobody tells me anything anymore. End quote. Over dinner, Daniel was warmer than he and oppose. Been in years, refilled my water glass without being asked about my knee, my apartment, whether the heat worked all right on Larkspur. Vanessa smiled a great deal and touched my arm twice, which she had never done in 10 years of marriage to my son. It was Daniel, near the end of the meal, who brought it up, so casually that I understood immediately how much rehearsal had gone into the casualness. And quote, hey, so random thing, Mom. Vanessa found some old paperwork of Dad and Oppo's. Something called Aurelia Holdings? We and Oppo's. Trying to close out his affairs properly, make sure nothing and Oppo's. Left hanging that could cause a tax problem down the road. Would you mind if I had a lawyer friend just take a quick look? Purely to protect you, honestly. The last thing you need is the IRS showing up about some old shell thing Dad forgot to dissolve. End quote. The last thing you need, as if he had ever once in the 8 months since the funeral asked what I needed. I set my fork down. End quote. That and oppose. Thoughtful of you, end quote, I said. End quote. Let me think about it. End quote. Sophie across the table was watching her father with an expression I recognized because I and oppose. Worn at myself once at her age watching adults negotiate around a truth nobody would name out loud. I drove home that night and called Grace before I and oppose. Even taken my coat off. End quote. They and oppose. Not curious anymore, end quote, I said. End quote. They and oppose. Recircling. End quote. End quote. Then it and oppose, time, end quote. Grace said, end quote, to decide how this ends, end quote. I want to tell you about the moment the story stopped being about money and became about something worse because I think it and oppose. The moment most families in situations like mine never see coming until it and oppose. Already happened to them. 6 weeks after the Sunday dinner I fell. It was nothing dramatic. A wet patch on the sidewalk outside my apartment building. A twisted ankle, a bruised hip. I called Daniel because he was listed as my emergency contact and because foolishly some small part of me still wanted him to come. He came within the hour. He also came, I would later learn, with a name already in his phone. Dr. Preston Ray, end quote, geriatric care consultant, end quote, who Vanessa had found through a friend of a friend, whose actual license Grace would later discover, had been suspended 11 years earlier in a different state for falsifying capacity evaluations in 3 separate guardianship cases, all of which had ended with elderly clients losing control of their assets to family members who had paid Dr. Ray and Oppo's fee. The visit itself happened on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the fall, while my ankle was still wrapped and propped on a kitchen chair. A man in a gray cardigan let himself into my apartment behind Daniel, carrying a clipboard and a leather bag, and introduced himself with a handshake so practiced it felt rehearsed. End quote. Mrs. Voss, I and Oppos, Dr. Ray. I do geriatric consulting work. Nothing to worry about, just a standard check-in given your recent fall. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions? End quote. End quote. Not at all, end quote, I said, and I watched him set up a small recorder on my kitchen table, the kind of gesture meant to look official rather than actually be official. End quote. Can you tell me today an Oppo's date? End quote. I told him. End quote. Wonderful. And can you tell me who the current president is? End quote. I told him that too and watched a small flicker of something cross his face. Not satisfaction, which is what you and Oppo's expect from a man doing his job well, but a faint, almost imperceptible disappointment. The look of a man whose paycheck depended on a different set of answers. End quote. Let and Oppo's try something a little harder, end quote, he said, his voice unchanged, pleasant as ever. End quote. Can you count backward from 100 by 7s for me? End quote. End quote. 100, end quote. I promise you it in Oppo's purely precautionary. Families just want to make sure their elderly loved ones are supported. End quote. End quote. He and Oppo's not a doctor exactly, end quote. Daniel admitted when I asked him directly, once Ray had packed up his recorder and left. End quote. He and Apo's more of an evaluator. For insurance purposes. In case we ever needed to make decisions on your behalf. It and Apo's just a precaution, Mom. End quote. End quote. A precaution against what? End quote. Daniel didn't and Apo's answer that. He didn't and Apo's need to. I understood, sitting in my own kitchen with a swollen ankle propped on a chair, that my son had brought a stranger into my home to build a paper case that I was losing my mind, not because I was, but because a legal finding of incapacity was the single fastest route to the thing he and Vanessa actually wanted, which was legal control over Aurelia Holdings before they even fully understood what Aurelia Holdings was. Dr. Ray and Apo's report, filed 3 weeks later with a probate attorney Vanessa had quietly retained, described me as exhibiting and quote, concerning gaps in short-term memory and quote, and quote, vulnerability to financial exploitation that necessitates protective oversight and quote, it recommended a guardianship evaluation. I never once in that entire visit failed to answer a single question correctly. I answered every one of them exactly right on purpose, watching Dr. Ray and Apo's face fall slightly each time, because a man paid to find incapacity does not get paid for finding a sharp mind. He wrote the report anyway. That night I called Grace, and for the first time in 8 months my voice shook. End quote. They and Apo's trying to have me declared incompetent, end quote, I said. Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost all its usual dryness. End quote. Eleanor, end quote, she said. End quote. I need you to listen to me carefully. This is no longer a family behaving badly. This is elder financial abuse, and it is a crime. I and Apo's watched families cross this line before, and once they cross it, they very rarely stop on their own. End quote. She paused. End quote. I think it and Apo's time to stop watching what your son becomes, and start protecting what and Apo's left of you, end quote. I looked down at my hands, 63 years old, still strong, still capable of running a company I and Apo's built from a kitchen table. End quote. What do we do? End quote. I asked. End quote. We let them think it and Apo's working, end quote, Grace said. End quote. For just a little while longer. And then we make sure the trap they built for you closes on them instead. End quote. Sophie was the one who broke it open. She was 17, quiet, observant in the way children are when the adults around them have taught them, without meaning to, that safety depends on noticing things and saying nothing. But she loved me, genuinely, uncomplicatedly, the way children love grandmothers who show up with real attention instead of performance. And after Dr. Ray and Apo's visit, after she overheard her parents arguing in low voices about, end quote, the guardianship timeline, end quote, through her bedroom wall, she called me from the school library, whispering, end quote, Grandma, I think Mom and Dad are trying to do something bad to you. I heard them talking about a lawyer and a petition for guardianship. Mom said something about and Apo's, once we have control of the assets and Apo's, and I don and Apo's, understand what assets, Grandma, we don and Apo's, have any money, but she said it like, end quote, Sophie and Apo's voice cracked. End quote, like they're and Apo's something you have that they want. End quote. I closed my eyes. 17 years old, and she was the one telling me the truth her own parents had spent 8 months hiding. End quote. Sophie, end quote, I said gently. End quote. I need you to do something very brave for me. Can you write down anything else you hear? Just dates and as close to their exact words as you can remember. Don and Apo's, ask questions. Don and Apo's, tell them you heard anything. Can you do that? End quote. End quote. Are they going to hurt you? End quote. End quote. No, end quote, I said, and I meant it because I had already decided that I would not let them. End quote. But I need your help to stop them before they hurt themselves. End quote. Vanessa and Apo's isolation campaign began the following week, though I Don and Apo's believe she thought of it that way. I doubt she thought of it as anything at all beyond convenience. She began, end quote, helping, end quote, arrange my calendar, my rides to appointments, my phone calls with Sophie, always with a reasonable explanation, always framed as care. Visits with Sophie became, end quote, not a great week, sweetie. Sophie and Apo's got finals, end quote. Phone calls went unreturned for days, then apologized for with a story about a dead phone battery. When I mentioned once that I hadn't and Apo's T seen Sophie in almost a month. Vanessa and Apos. S smile went thin at the edges. End quote. Kids that age need boundaries, Eleanor. Sophie and Apos. S very impressionable, and honestly some of the things you and Apos V been saying to her about Idon and Apos. Tino family loyalty, old grudges, it and Apos. S not helpful for her mental health right now. End quote. I understood the sentence for what it was. A warning. Stop talking to my daughter about the truth, or I will cut her off from you entirely. I stopped mentioning it out loud. I did not stop Sophie and Apos. S whispered calls from the library 3 times a week, each one logged carefully in the leather planner alongside everything else. The isolation did not happen all at once. It happened the way water finds its way into a foundation. Slowly through small cracks, until one day you look up and realize the whole basement is standing in an inch of it. By week 4, Vanessa had taken over and coordinating and my medical appointments, which meant 3 appointments were rescheduled without my knowledge and 1 referral to a physical therapist simply never got made at all. By week 6, my weekly dinner invitation stopped arriving, replaced by vague texts. Things are crazy this week, rain check? That never converted into an actual rescheduled date. By week 8, when I called the house directly instead of waiting to be invited, Sophie answered and I could hear Vanessa and Apos' voice in the background, tight and quick. Tell her you and Apos. Redoing homework, tell her we and Apos. I'll call her back. Sophie did not tell me that. Sophie, holding the phone against her ear in a hallway where her mother couldn't and Apos. See her face, whispered instead. End quote. Grandma, they Don and Apos. T want me talking to you alone anymore. Mom said you and Apos. V been saying things that aren't and Apos. T good for me to hear. I Don and Apos. T even know what she means. What things? End quote. End quote. I honestly Don and Apos. T know either, sweetheart, end quote, I said. End quote. But I want you to know that whatever she tells you I and Apos. V been saying, you can always just ask me directly. I will always tell you the truth, even when it and Apos. Complicated. That and Apos. A promise. End quote. End quote. Okay, end quote. Sophie said, very small. End quote. I have to go. She and Apos. Coming. End quote. I did not call the house directly again after that. Instead, Sophie and I built our library system, 3 brief calls a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, always from a different corner of the school building, always logged the moment we hung up, dated in a hand that had gotten steadier with practice instead of shaking with the grief and fear I and Apos carried in those first months. Week 8, 1 entry read. Reports V. Told her I have and Apos, confused thinking and Apos, and that visits need to be and Apos, limited for now and Apos, cross-reference against Ray visit, same week. Week 9. Reports overhearing phone call V to unknown party, end quote. Once the evaluation and Apos, filed, this moves fast, end quote. Ask Grace whether, end quote, fast, end quote, suggests a specific attorney already retained. Week 10. Petition filed. By the 10th week, the probate attorney Vanessa had retained filed a formal petition for guardianship and conservatorship of the person and estate of Eleanor Marshvoss, citing Dr. Ray and Apos' evaluation and, end quote, escalating concerns regarding financial vulnerability and self-neglect, end quote. Daniel called me the day it was filed. His voice tight with something that might have been guilt, if guilt were a feeling my son still allowed himself to have all the way through. End quote. Mom, listen, I need you to understand this in an Apos. To this in an Apos. T about control. This is about protecting you. Vanessa and I talked to a lawyer, and honestly, with your fall and some of the confusion Dr. Ray noted, we just think it and Apos. Safer if I and Apos am formally in charge of things. Just until you and Apos back on your feet. End quote. End quote. I understand, end quote, I said. End quote. You and Apos not upset? End quote. I looked out my kitchen window at the parking lot of my Larkspur apartment, at a life my son believed was the whole of what I had. End quote. I think, end quote, I said carefully, end quote, that you and Apos about to learn something about your mother that and Apos. Marcus had worked as a junior facilities auditor at Voss Sterling in its early expansion years, before leaving to become an investigative journalist covering healthcare fraud for a regional paper that had, like most regional papers, slowly died around him. Walter had liked him enormously. I had liked him too. He was the rare kind of man who noticed discrepancies not because he was paid to, but because discrepancies genuinely bothered him. And quote, Mrs. Voss and quote, he said, standing awkwardly in my doorway. And quote, I and Oppos. I'm sorry to just show up like this. Grace Sterling gave me your address. I think you and I might need to talk about a man named Preston Ray. End quote. I let him in. Over 2 cups of coffee gone cold in my small kitchen, Marcus laid out what he and Oppos D spent 3 weeks digging into after Grace quietly had asked him, off the books as a favor to an old friend, to look into the and quote, geriatric care consultant and quote, my son had hired. And quote, Ray and Oppos' license was suspended in Ohio 11 years ago, end quote, Marcus said, sliding a printout across the table. End quote. Falsified capacity evaluations, 3 separate cases. All 3 ended with elderly clients, 2 women 1 man, declared incompetent and placed under guardianship of family members who and Oppos D paid Ray and Oppos' fee up front. In 2 of those cases the family sold the client and Oppos' home within 4 months of the guardianship being granted. In the third, the client died 18 months later, and an internal audit found roughly $60,000 unaccounted for from her accounts. End quote. My hands went cold around my coffee mug. End quote. He moved to a different state, changed how he advertised himself and Oppos, consultant and Oppos instead of and Oppos, doctor and Oppos, technically legal since he never claims a medical license outright, and he and Oppos' been doing exactly the same thing for 11 years. 6 more guardianship cases since. 4 of them, family members admitted afterward on background that they and Oppos D approached Ray specifically because someone had recommended him as quote and Oppos, someone who gets the job done and Oppos and quote. End quote. Someone recommended him to Vanessa and quote, I said quietly. End quote. A woman named Renata Cole. Vanessa and Oppos' second cousin. Her father went through a Ray guardianship 8 years ago in Pennsylvania. End quote. Marcus looked at me steadily. End quote. This ISN and Oppos T the first family Ray and Oppos helped exploit an elderly parent Mrs. Voss. It and Oppos not even close to the first. And I Don and Oppos T think it and Oppos a coincidence that your daughter-in-law found him through someone who already knew exactly what he does and quote. I sat with that for a long moment, the knowledge that what was happening to me was not a single family and Oppos' private cruelty but a small quiet repeated machine, greased by referrals between people who had learned that elderly relatives could be legally dismantled for profit if you found the right unlicensed man with the right paperwork. He pulled one more sheet from the folder, a photograph printed from a newspaper archive, of an elderly man in a cardigan standing in front of a small brick house, smiling stiffly for the camera. End quote. This is Harold Bennett and quote, Marcus said. End quote, Ray and Oppos' first known case back in Ohio. I drove out to see him 3 weeks ago. He and Oppos' 81 now, lives in a 1-bedroom assisted living unit his son picked out for him. Not the nice kind, Mrs. Voss, the kind with a shared bathroom down the hall. He told me he still has dreams about that house behind him in the photo. Says he wakes up angry every single time, and then he remembers it and Oppos' been 11 years and there and Oppos' nothing left to be angry about because the house is gone, the money and Oppos' gone and his son stopped visiting 6 years ago end quote. End quote. Did he know why his son stopped visiting? End quote. End quote. He thinks it and Oppos' guilt end quote, Marcus said quietly. End quote. He thinks his son can and Oppos' stand to look at what he did. He also told me something I haven't and Oppos' been able to stop thinking about since. He said and Oppos, the worst part wasn't and Oppos losing the house. It was the 6 weeks before the hearing, when everyone kept telling me I was imagining things being wrong. That and Oppos' the part that actually breaks you. Not the theft. The gaslighting that comes before it, so by the time they take everything you and Oppos too worn down to even be sure you deserve to keep it. And Oppos end quote. I sat very still in my kitchen thinking of the folder Daniel had left on my table 2 weeks after Walter and Oppos' funeral, thinking of Dr. Ray and Oppos' clipboard, thinking of every soft, reasonable voice that had told me, over the past 8 months, that surely I was simply forgetting things, surely I was simply overwhelmed, Surely the sensible thing was to let someone else hold the wheel for a while. End quote. He and Oppos s right, end quote, I said. End quote. It very nearly did. End quote. End quote. Will you testify? End quote, I asked. End quote. I and Oppos I'll do better than testify, end quote, Marcus said. End quote. I and Oppos I'll publish. I and Oppos we already got two of Ray and Oppos s other victims and Oppos families willing to go on record. This ISN and Oppos T just going to save you from a guardianship petition, Mrs. Voss. This is going to end his career for good and possibly send him to prison. End quote. I thought of the elderly man in Ohio whose $60,000 had disappeared. I thought of Sophie, 17 and terrified, calling me from a library. End quote. Then let and Oppos s do both, end quote, I said. End quote. Save me and stop him from doing this to anyone else. End quote. Marcus nodded, gathering his folder. At the door he paused. End quote. Grace tells me there and Oppos s more to this than a guardianship fight, end quote. He said carefully. End quote. She wooed and Oppos T say what? But she said when this is over, I might have a much bigger story than Preston Ray. End quote. I looked at him for a long moment and then for the first time in 8 months, I told someone outside my own carefully built circle the truth. End quote, Mr. Webb, end quote, I said. End quote. How would you like to write about the founder of Voss Sterling Health Group? End quote. Marcus went very still. End quote, Eleanor Marsh, end quote. He said slowly. End quote, you and Oppos re, end quote. End quote. Come to the hearing, end quote, I said. End quote, bring a notepad. I think you and Oppos re going to want to see this in person. End quote. Grace and I made one final decision together before the hearing, and it was the hardest one of the entire 10 years. End quote. We could end the guardianship petition right now, end quote. Grace said, spreading documents across her desk. Ray and Oppos s suspended license history, Marcus and Oppos s research, the leather planner and Oppos s 8 months of dated meticulous notes. End quote. I could file a motion to dismiss tomorrow morning with enough evidence to bury it. Your son and daughter-in-law would never even have to stand in front of a judge. End quote. End quote. But? End quote, I said because I could hear the but sitting behind her words. End quote. But if we do that quietly, it stays a private family matter. A lawyer and Oppos s letter, a withdrawn petition. An awkward Thanksgiving forever after. Daniel and Vanessa learn nothing except that they got caught this time, end quote. Grace looked at me over her glasses. End quote. You told me 8 months ago you wanted to find out whether your son could become someone different when he thought there was nothing left to gain. Eleanor, I Don and Oppos T think you and Oppos V found that answer yet. I think you and Oppos V only found out what he does when he thinks they're in Oppos s nothing to lose either. If you want to see what happens when everything is on the line publicly when they're in Oppos s no more room to pretend, you let this go to the hearing. End quote. I sat with that for a long time. End quote. There and Oppos s a difference, end quote. I said slowly, end quote, between teaching my son a lesson and destroying him. I Don and Oppos T want revenge, Grace. I want the truth to be the thing that decides what happens next. Whatever that truth turns out to be. End quote. End quote. Then let an Oppos s make sure the truth has a very large room to stand in, end quote, Grace said, and for the first time in months she smiled the way she used to smile in board meetings, right before she said something that changed the direction of a company. End quote. The Saint Aurelia and Oppos s pediatric cardiac wing dedication, end quote, she said. End quote. It and Oppos s scheduled for the same week as the guardianship hearing. The board and Oppos s been asking for 2 years to finally name their anonymous benefactor publicly. I and Oppos v held them off every time. I think it and Oppos s time to say yes. End quote. I understood immediately what she was proposing, and for a moment I could not speak. End quote. You want to reveal Aurelia Holdings, end quote, I said, end quote, at the same event where half the hospital board, half the city and Oppos s business community, and if I know my son, end quote. Let them keep believing they and Oppos v won, end quote, I said quietly, end quote, right up until the moment they Haven and Oppos T, end quote. Grace nodded and began writing. Before Grace left my kitchen that evening, she paused at the door, her coat half on. End quote. Can I say something as your friend and not your lawyer? End quote, she asked. End quote. You usually do anyway. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos. V known you for 38 years, Eleanor. I watched you build a company out of a kitchen table while men in boardrooms called you Walter and Oppos' secretary. I watched you bury your husband and then get evicted from your own front porch 3 days later without raising your voice once. I have never, in 38 years, seen you do a single reckless thing. End quote. She looked at me carefully. End quote. This gala is the closest you and Oppos ever come. If it goes wrong, if Daniel and Vanessa decide to make a scene, if the press asks questions you and Oppos not ready to answer, if Sophie gets caught in the middle of something ugly in front of 300 strangers, there and Oppos no undoing it. You understand that. End quote. End quote. I understand it. End quote, I said. End quote. I and Oppos V thought about almost nothing else for 2 weeks. End quote. End quote. And? End quote. End quote. And I think I and Oppos V spent an entire year being careful and patient and quiet, Grace, exactly the way I was taught to be my whole life, first by my father, then by a boardroom full of men who wanted my numbers but not my name on the door, then by a decade of hiding what Walter and I built so our son Wooden and Oppos be corrupted by it. I am tired of being careful in rooms where other people get to be reckless with my life and call it protection. I want just once to walk into a room on my own terms and let the truth be loud. Not for revenge. Because I and Oppos V earned it. End quote. Grace studied me for a long moment, then smiled. Not her dry courtroom smile, but something softer, older, the smile of a woman who had waited a long time to watch her friend stop apologizing for the size of her own life. End quote. All right, end quote, she said. End quote. Then let and Oppos build you a very good stage. End quote. 2 weeks later, invitations went out for the St. Aurelia and Oppos Regional Medical Center Pediatric Cardiac Wing Dedication Gala, featuring, per the engraved card, a special announcement regarding the wing and Oppos founding benefactor. Daniel and Vanessa received theirs through his employer, Sterling Regional Investment Partners, which Grace had confirmed weeks earlier through channels neither of them would ever trace back to me. Managed nearly 40% of its total assets under management through funds connected to Voss Sterling Health Group. My son had spent 3 years trying to get himself noticed by senior partners at a firm that existed, in significant part because of money I controlled, and he had never once known it. He RSVP and Oppos yes within the hour, thrilled, telling Vanessa it might finally be his chance to get in front of the partners who mattered. I read that detail in Grace and Oppos' summary and, for the first time in 8 months, laughed out loud alone in my small kitchen on Larkspur Avenue. The guardianship hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee. Daniel sat beside Vanessa and their attorney, wearing a suit I recognized from Walter and Oppos' funeral, adjusted since Vanessa and Oppos' doing probably a size sharper, more expensive, purchased with money that had once been the sale price of my house. I sat beside Grace. Marcus Webb sat 2 rows behind us with a notepad, and Sophie sat, defiantly, beside me instead of beside her parents, having told them flatly the night before that she was coming to support her grandmother and that they could be angry about it later. Daniel and Oppos' attorney opened with Dr. Preston Ray and Oppos' evaluation describing, in quote, documented cognitive decline, in quote, and, in quote, a pattern of vulnerability, in quote, that necessitated protective guardianship. Grace stood. And quote, Your Honor, before we proceed further with Dr. Ray and Oppos' evaluation, I and Oppos' like to enter into evidence documentation regarding Mr. Ray and Oppos' professional history, end quote. What followed took 11 minutes, and I watched my son and Oppos' face change color 3 separate times. Grace laid out, methodically, without a single raised word, the suspended license in Ohio, the 3 prior falsified evaluations, the 6 subsequent guardianship cases in as many years, the $60,000 unaccounted for in one victim and Oppos' estate, the referral chain that traced directly back through Vanessa and Oppos' cousin Renata Cole. She entered Marcus and Oppos' research as supporting documentation. She entered 8 months of dated, contemporaneous notes from my leather planner, establishing precisely when the pattern of pressure, isolation and financial inquiry had begun, beginning, notably, 6 days after Vanessa discovered the old Aurelia Holdings paperwork, not, as Daniel and Apos' petition claimed, out of concern following my fall. End quote. The timeline, Your Honor, does not support a narrative of a family responding to a mother and Apos' declining capacity, end quote, Grace said. End quote. It supports a narrative of a family responding to the discovery of undisclosed assets and attempting to secure legal control over those assets through a guardianship petition built on a fraudulent capacity evaluation from a man with a documented history of manufacturing exactly this kind of finding for profit, end quote. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Okonkwo who had clearly seen every version of this particular tragedy before, turned to Daniel and Apos' attorney. End quote. Counsel, did your clients conduct any independent verification of Dr. Ray and Apos' credentials before relying on his evaluation as the basis for this petition? End quote. Daniel and Apos' attorney glanced at Daniel, who was staring at the table. End quote. Your Honor, my clients were acting in good faith based on a referral. End quote. End quote. A referral from a relative whose own father was subjected to a nearly identical guardianship 8 years ago. End quote. Judge Okonkwo said, not unkindly, but not gently either. End quote. I and Apos' like to hear directly from the petitioner. End quote. Daniel stood, unsteady, buttoning his jacket out of habit rather than composure. End quote. Your Honor, I love my mother, end quote, he said, and his voice cracked in a way that, for one terrible moment, made me want to reach out and take his hand the way I had 1,000 times when he was small and frightened of something in the dark. End quote. I genuinely thought I was protecting her. End quote. End quote. Mr. Voss, end quote, Judge Okonkwo said. End quote. Did you or your wife retain a private investigator to research an entity called Aurelia Holdings prior to your mother and Apos' fall or after? End quote. Silence stretched through the courtroom. End quote. Before, end quote, Daniel said finally, very quietly. End quote. And did that investigation factor into your decision to pursue this guardianship petition? End quote. Daniel did not answer. He didn't, and Apos' need to. The silence answered for him, and I watched something in my son and Apos' posture collapse, not from anger, not yet, but from the particular exhaustion of a man realizing in real time in front of a judge and his own daughter that he no longer had a version of events he could defend. Vanessa and Apos' attorney rose once more before the ruling, attempting a final thin argument that even setting aside Ray and Apos' credentials, the petition had been filed, end quote, out of an abundance of caution consistent with a family and Apos' duty of care, end quote, and that no formal finding of bad faith should attach to a family simply for erring toward protection. Judge Okonkwo did not raise her voice, which somehow made the response land harder than if she had. End quote. Counsel, end quote, she said, end quote, a family exercising a genuine duty of care conducts that inquiry openly, with their loved one and Apos' participation and dignity intact, using licensed professionals whose findings can withstand scrutiny. What I have in front of me instead is a petition built on a paid evaluation from a man with a documented history of manufacturing findings for profit, filed within weeks of the petitioners discovering assets they didn't and Apos' previously know existed, pursued without ever once disclosing to Mrs. Voss the true financial stakes involved. That is not an abundance of caution. That is a strategy, and I intend to treat it as one. End quote. She denied the guardianship petition, ordered Dr. Ray and Apos' evaluation stricken from the record, and referred to the state licensing board and the district attorney and Apos' office for review, and set a follow-up hearing to address potential sanctions for the petition itself. Before the bailiff called the next case, Judge Okonkwo paused, looking over her glasses first at Daniel, then at me. End quote. Mrs. Voss, end quote, she said. End quote. I Don and Apos' often address parties directly outside the record, but I and Apos' been on this bench 19 years, and I and Apos' seen more of these petitions than I and Apos' like to count. Most of the time, by the time they reach me, there isn't and Apos' much left to salvage between the people involved. I hope whatever happens next in your family, that isn't and Apos' true here. In the hallway outside the courtroom, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look 10 years older than they were, Daniel approached me. Not Vanessa, who stood apart near the elevators with her arms crossed, staring at the floor. End quote, Mom, end quote, he said. End quote, can we talk? Just for a second, end quote. Grace touched my elbow, a silent question. Do you want me here for this? And I shook my head slightly. She stepped back, but not far. End quote, I don't and oppose. To understand what just happened in there, end quote. Daniel said, his voice low, urgent. End quote. The investigator Vanessa hired said the paperwork was real. The consultant said your evaluation showed real concerns. Every single person we talked to told us we were doing the responsible thing. End quote. End quote. Every person you paid, end quote. I said quietly, end quote. Told you what you were already looking for. That and oppose. S not the same as the truth, Daniel. You just spent 11 minutes watching Grace demonstrate exactly how much daylight there is between those two things. End quote. He was quiet for a moment, jaw working. End quote, is it true? End quote, he asked finally. End quote, the Aurelia Holdings thing. Is there actually something there? End quote. I looked at my son, 63 years into a life he had known almost nothing true about for the last decade of it, and I thought about every version of this answer I could give him. A soft one, a cruel one, a delaying one. End quote, you and oppose. LL find out on Thursday, end quote, I said. End quote, same as everyone else, end quote. Daniel did not look at me again as they left the courthouse. Vanessa did, once from across the lobby, a look that had nothing left of contempt in it, only the flat, calculating fear of someone realizing the ground beneath her had never been where she thought it was. I did not smile. I did not feel triumphant. I felt mostly tired and grateful for Sophie and Appo's hand tucked quietly into mine as we walked out into the gray afternoon. End quote, that and Appo's Ray handled, end quote. Grace murmured to me, gathering her files in the parking lot. End quote, now. Let and Appo's go get you dressed for a gala. End quote. The St. Aurelia and Appo's Regional Medical Center Pediatric Cardiac Wing dedication was held 4 days later, in a ballroom strung with soft gold light, filled with 300 people in evening wear. Doctors, board members, city council members, and seated at a table near the front reserved for Sterling Regional Investment Partners, my son and his wife, who had accepted the invitation weeks earlier believing it might finally open a door for Daniel and Appo's career. I arrived late, deliberately, in a plain navy dress I and Appo's owned for 6 years, and took my seat at a small table near the stage that Grace had reserved under the name E. Marsh. I watched Daniel from across the room for nearly 20 minutes before he noticed me. When he did, his face went through confusion, then irritation. Why is Mom here at this, of all places? Before settling into a strained public smile, the kind you wear when you and Appo's not sure yet whether something is a problem. The hospital and Appo's board chair took the podium at 8:00 and Appo's clock. End quote, tonight, end quote, she said, end quote, we celebrate not just a new wing, but a decade of quiet, extraordinary generosity from a benefactor who has funded pediatric cardiac care at this hospital, and at 4 sister facilities across this state, without ever once asking for recognition, end quote. She paused, scanning the room. End quote. Tonight at her request, that changes, end quote. I felt Grace and Appo's hand find mine under the table. End quote, it is my honor, end quote. The board chair continued, end quote, to finally introduce the founder and majority owner of Voss Sterling Health Group, whose late husband Walter Voss began this work 50 years ago from a single staffing office, and whose vision and whose trust has quietly guided this institution and dozens of others ever since. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Eleanor Marsh Voss. End quote. I stood. I want to describe my son and Appo's face in that moment honestly because I have thought about it every day since. It was not anger, not at first. It was the particular total collapse of a man and Appo's entire private map of the world, the recognition all at once that the mother he had left with $20 on her own porch, the mother he had tried to have declared incompetent, the mother whose house sale he had pocketed without a second thought, was the same woman whose trust, whose company, whose money had quietly built the very career he and Appo's spent 3 years trying to climb toward. Grace walked with me as far as the edge of the stage. End quote, you Don and Appo's this room a single word more than you want to give it, end quote, she murmured. End quote, say what and Appo's as true. Nothing else. End quote. I nodded and climbed the 3 shallow steps alone. The applause quieted as I reached the podium, 300 faces turning toward a woman most of them had never seen before, in a plain navy dress that had cost $40 off a department store rack 6 years earlier. I found Sophie and Apos, S face first near the back beaming. I found Marcus next, notepad already open. I did not, at first, let myself find Daniel and Apos, S. I walked to the podium and adjusted the microphone, and only then did I let myself look at his table. He was staring at me the way you and Apos, D stare at a photograph that had rearranged itself while you Warren and Apos, T looking, trying visibly to reconcile the mother who and Apos, D sat in a Motel 6 with $20 folded into quarters against the woman a hospital board chair had just introduced as the founder of a health system worth more than his entire firm and Apos, S regional book of business. Beside him, Vanessa had gone completely still, her champagne glass forgotten halfway to her mouth. End quote. 50 years ago, end quote, I said, end quote. My husband had an idea and no head for numbers. I had a head for numbers and no idea anyone would ever let me use it. We built this together quietly because we believed the work mattered more than the recognition, end quote. I paused. End quote. We also built it quietly in later years for a different reason, one I hoped I would never have to speak about publicly. We built a wall between what we had and the people we loved most, because we were afraid of what money does to families who Don and Apos, T understand where it came from or what it costs to build. End quote. I looked out at 300 faces, none of whom yet understood what I was about to say, and one face, my son and Apos, S that understood completely. End quote. This past year, end quote, I said, end quote, I learned exactly what that fear had been protecting against. And I learned, more importantly, that the wall was never the real protection. The truth was. So tonight I and Apos, D like to stop hiding behind either one. End quote. I told them everything, not Daniel and Apos, S name, not the courtroom, not the guardianship petition. That was not the gala and Apos, S business. But I told them who I was, what Aurelia Holdings had funded over the years without ever seeking credit, and I announced, to genuine gasps and applause, a new initiative. The Voss Family Elder Protection Fund, which would provide free legal advocacy to elderly patients across all 5 Voss Sterling facilities who suspected financial exploitation by family members or caregivers, in memory, I said, end quote, of every person who has ever been made to feel powerless by the very people who were supposed to protect them. End quote. The applause was long and genuine. Somewhere near the middle of the room I heard a man and Apos, S voice, one of Sterling Regional and Apos, S senior partners I would learn later, a man named Howard Pruitt who had spent 3 years politely declining to remember Daniel and Apos, S name at company functions, say not quietly enough, end quote, wait Voss? As in our Voss Sterling relationship? Someone find out if that and Apos, S the Daniel Voss on our team. End quote. I did not look at Daniel and Apos, S table once during the applause. I didn't and Apos T need to. I could feel from across the room the exact moment my son understood that the story he and Apos, D spent 8 months telling himself, we and Apos, re-protecting mom, we and Apos, redoing what and Apos S necessary, had just been permanently and publicly replaced by a truer one, standing at a podium in a plain navy dress, thanking a room full of strangers for their support. I want to tell you one more thing before I tell you what happened to everyone because I think it matters and because for a long time I didn't and Apos, T know it myself. 3 months after the gala, Sophie told me something that changed how I understood Vanessa. Not enough to forgive what she and Apos, D done, but enough to stop imagining her as a cartoon villain twirling a mustache in my nightmares, which is easier, honestly, than understanding a real person and Apos, S smallness. End quote. She retained her own lawyer, separate from Dad and Apos, S end quote. Sophie told me over coffee, the two of us at a small cafe near her college campus, a standing Sunday ritual we and Apos, D kept since the hearing. End quote. I heard her on the phone with him once before she moved out. She wasn't an Apos. T crying about you, Grandma. She was crying about her mother. Grandma Renata, Mom and Apos. S mom, I mean not the cousin, apparently spent years telling Mom that being and Apos, clever and Apos, about money was the only real inheritance poor people ever get. That waiting for someone to give you something is how you stay poor forever. I think Mom genuinely believed finding that paperwork was her one chance to finally do something and Apos, clever and Apos, Like it was owed to her somehow, for a whole childhood of watching her own mom get nothing from people who had everything, end quote. I sat with that for a long moment, stirring a coffee I didn't and oppose. T really want. End quote. That doesn't end oppose. T excuse it, end quote, I said finally. End quote, I know, end quote, Sophie said. End quote, I and oppose am not saying it does. I used to think mom was just mean. Now I think she was scared her whole life, and being mean was just what the scared turned into once she had the chance to stop being scared for good. End quote, she looked down at her cup. End quote, is that stupid? End quote. End quote, no, end quote, I said. End quote, it and oppose. The least stupid thing anyone and oppose said to me about any of this. End quote. Vanessa, for her part, never contacted me directly again after the gala. Not an apology, not a justification, not even the anger I might have expected. Grace told me months later that Vanessa and oppose's separate attorney had advised her correctly that any communication with me during the pending district attorney and oppose's review could be used against her, and I and oppose's since wondered how much of her silence was legal strategy and how much was simply shame too large to put into words. I don and oppose T know which. I and oppose. V decided I don and oppose. T need to know. Some doors once they and oppose. V done the damage they were built to do, Rn and oppose. T owed a second knock. She kept her job at the accounting firm where she and oppose. D worked for 11 years, though two colleagues, Sophie later told me, quietly stopped inviting her to lunch once the local paper ran Marcus and oppose's story with her name in it. She sold the wedding ring within a year of the divorce being finalized, not out of desperation as far as I know, simply out of the plain practical calculus of a woman rebuilding a life on a single income in a city that had gotten more expensive without asking anyone and oppose's permission. I think about that sometimes, how much of what looked from where I stood like greed was actually just fear wearing a more expensive coat. I don and oppose. T forgive Vanessa. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like this one are too quick sometimes to hand out forgiveness like a party favor at the end, as if a decade of harm dissolves the moment the credits roll. What I and oppose V settled into instead is something smaller and more honest. I understand her a little, the way you can understand a house fire started by a faulty wire without ever once excusing the smoke damage. Understanding ISN and oppose. T the same as absolution. It and oppose. As just the difference between hating a stranger and grieving a person you can almost picture choosing differently, in some other version of her life that never happened. The follow-up hearing 3 weeks after the gala was brief. Judge Okonkwo, having reviewed the sanctions motion Grace filed, found that the guardianship petition had been brought in bad faith, based on a capacity evaluation the petitioners knew or should have known was unreliable, time suspiciously close to their discovery of previously undisclosed family assets. She ordered Daniel and Vanessa to pay my legal fees in full and referred the matter formally to the district attorney and oppose's elder abuse unit for review of potential criminal exploitation charges. Preston Ray was arrested 11 days later on fraud charges connected to 3 of his prior cases. Marcus Webb and oppose's published investigation cited directly in the district attorney and oppose's press release. He would eventually plead guilty and serve 4 years, with restitution ordered to 5 families, including the Ohio family whose $60,000 had never been recovered. Vanessa was not charged criminally. The district attorney determined there was insufficient evidence she had known, with certainty, that Ray and oppose's evaluation was fraudulent, though the finding noted pointedly that she and quote, exhibited a documented pattern of willful blindness toward information that would have been readily available with minimal diligence, end quote. She lost her position on the hospital auxiliary board she and oppose's joined the year before, a social humiliation I understood from Sophie that wounded her more than any court finding could have. Her marriage to Daniel did not survive the year. I never learned and never asked the specifics of what finally broke between them, only that Sophie moved in with Daniel afterward by her own choice. Daniel lost his position at Sterling Regional Investment Partners 3 months after the gala, not through any action of mine. I never once asked Grace to intervene in his employment, and told her plainly I did not want her to, but because the firm and oppose's senior partners, having learned publicly at the gala whose trust underwrote a significant portion of their assets, quietly reviewed his personnel file and found the timeline of his mother and oppose's guardianship petition sitting uncomfortably. Beside his sudden aggressive interest in getting closer to the firm and Oppo's biggest institutional relationship. Nobody accused him of anything formally. He was simply gently let go, the way firms let people go when keeping them has become more awkward than useful. I did not celebrate any of it. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be a lie to pretend the 10 months between the funeral and the follow-up hearing left me feeling only vindicated. Mostly in the quiet of my apartment on Larkspur, which I kept, by the way, for another full year after the gala, unable quite yet to let go of the version of myself who had learned to survive there. I felt grief. Not for the money and not even entirely for the house. Grief for the son I had raised, who I had believed, right up until the moment a judge asked him a direct question in a quiet courtroom, might still choose differently than he did. Daniel called me once, for months after he lost his job, late at night, his voice unsteady with something that might have been whiskey or might simply have been shame. And quote, I don't and Oppo's. To even know why I did it, and quote, he said. And quote, I keep trying to understand it, Mom. I think somewhere along the way I stopped seeing you as someone who could be hurt. You were just Mom. The person who was always going to be fine no matter what we did. I don't and Oppo's. Know when that happened. And quote. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment in the dark, in the apartment that had taught me exactly how little he and Oppo's once thought I needed. And quote, I think it happened, and quote, I said quietly, and quote, the day your father and I decided you didn't and Oppo's need to know what we had. We thought we were protecting you from money. I think, without meaning to, we also taught you that I didn't and Oppo's need protecting myself. That and Oppo's not an excuse for what you did, Daniel. But I and Oppo's had a long time to sit with my part in it, and I wanted you to know I have. End quote. He was quiet for a long time. End quote. Is there any way back from this? End quote, he asked finally. End quote, for us? End quote. I thought about the $20 bill, still folded in quarters, still sitting in my nightstand drawer. End quote, I don't and Oppo's know yet, end quote, I said honestly. End quote. But I know it ISN and Oppo's going to happen through a phone call at 11 at night, for months after a hearing. If you want to find out, it and Oppo's going to take a lot longer than that, and it and Oppo's going to require you to show up for me the way you and Oppo's show up for someone who never had a single dollar to give you. Consistently. Without an angle. For a long time before I trust any of it. End quote. End quote, okay, end quote, he said quietly. End quote, okay. I can try that. End quote. I don't and Oppo's know yet as I write this whether he will. Some days he calls and it feels like the son I raised before grief and greed got tangled up together in him. Some days he doesn't and Oppo's call at all, and I let that be its own kind of information. But Sophie calls every Sunday at 4:00 and Oppo's clock without fail, and last spring at 19, she started her first year of nursing school on a full scholarship, the Voss Family Elder Protection Fund and Oppo's inaugural education grant awarded at her insistence through the same blind application process as every other applicant, judged entirely on merit, with no one on the review committee aware, until the decision had already been made, that the winning applicant was my own granddaughter. I want to tell you about one more person before I finish, because I think she and Oppo's the reason all of this mattered beyond my own family, and because I promised myself at the very beginning of building the Elder Protection Fund that I would never let this story become only about Daniel and Vanessa and me. There were and are so many families like theirs, and so many people like Harold Bennett, quietly disappearing into small rooms with shared bathrooms down the hall. Her name was Ruth Alvarez. She came to the fund and Oppo's intake office 18 months after the gala, 79 years old, walking with a cane, escorted by a granddaughter about Sophie and Oppo's age, who had found our number on a hospital bulletin board. Ruth and Oppo's son had convinced her over the course of a year to sign over power of attorney and quote, for convenience and quote, had moved her out of her condominium into a small rental he controlled, and had begun 6 weeks before she called us, using an unlicensed and quote, consultant and quote, to document her supposed cognitive decline. I sat with her myself, the first intake I and Oppo's done in person since the fund opened, because something about her granddaughter and Oppo's voice on the phone, young, frightened, fierce, had reminded me too much of Sophie to hand off to someone else. End quote, I keep thinking I and Oppo's am being dramatic and quote, Ruth told me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. And quote, everyone says he means well. Maybe he does mean well. Maybe I really am forgetting things. And quote, Mrs. Alvarez and quote, I said. And quote, can you tell me today an Appo's date? And quote, she told me without hesitation precisely. And quote, can you count backward from 100 by sevens? And quote, she did it faster than I had the first time someone asked me the same question in my own kitchen. And quote, you and Appo's, not being dramatic and quote, I told her. And quote, you are being asked to doubt yourself by someone who benefits from your doubt. Those are two very different things, and I promise you by the end of this, you will be able to tell them apart every single time. End quote. It took the fund in Appo's attorneys 4 months to unwind what her son had built. Ruth kept her condominium. The unlicensed consultant, a different man than Ray, working the same quiet racket in a different state, referred, we later discovered through an informal network of exactly the kind of family and quote, friends and quote, who had connected Vanessa to Ray in the first place, lost his consulting license entirely and is now barred from practicing anything resembling geriatric evaluation in 4 states. Ruth sends me a card every year on the anniversary of her intake appointment. Last year and Appo's read simply, still counting backward by sevens just fine. Thank you for believing me before I believed myself. That, more than the wing with my name on it, is the part of this story I and Appo's am proudest of. I still live simply. That part of me was never a performance for Daniel and Vanessa and Appo's benefit. It was true before the trust, true during the years I hid it, and true now that the whole state knows my name. I moved out of Larkspur eventually, into a small house not far from where Walter and I first lived. Smaller than the one Daniel sold, quieter, with a garden. I keep myself on my knees in the dirt most Saturday mornings, which is precisely where a woman who once balanced her father and Appo's overtime slips at 14 still feels most like herself. The Voss Family Elder Protection Fund has, in the 4 years since that gala, provided free legal advocacy to over 600 elderly patients across our facilities, 71 of whom have successfully fought fraudulent guardianship petitions filed against them by their own families. I did not build that program for Daniel and Appo's sake or for mine. I built it for the version of myself who sat on a stiff motel bedspread with $20 and no idea, yet, that the wall her husband had built to protect their family could also become the very thing that saved her from it. Grace Sterling still manages Aurelia Holdings, though these days I sit in on board meetings myself, in person using my own name, and no longer as an invisible trustee hiding behind someone else in Appo's voice. Marcus Webb won a Regional Journalism Award for the Preston Ray investigation and, at my invitation, now sits on the Elder Protection Fund and Appo's advisory board, keeping a watchful eye for exactly the kind of quiet exploitation machine he uncovered once already. Sophie graduates from nursing school next spring. She has already told me more than once that she intends to specialize in geriatric care, and quote, because of you, Grandma, and quote, she said the last time matter-of-factly, the way only the very young can say something enormous without seeming to notice its weight. And quote, because I watched what almost happened to you, and I never want anyone else and Appo's grandmother to go through that alone. End quote. I should tell you about the Sunday, about a year after the follow-up hearing, when I finally let Daniel back into my new house for dinner, the first meal we and Appo's shared alone since the gala. He arrived early, which surprised me, and stood on my porch for a moment before knocking, the way you might stand outside a door you weren't and Appo's entirely sure would open. And quote, you planted roses and quote, he said when I let him in, nodding toward the small bed along the front walk. And quote, like the ones Dad had. And quote. I dug up starts from the old house the week after they tore out the last of them, and quote, I admitted. And quote, I went back one more time before the new owners finished their renovation. Stood in the yard and cried like a fool over some rose bushes, and quote, Daniel was quiet for a moment. And quote, I didn't and Appo's know they tore those out. And quote, you wouldn't and Appo's have. You weren't and Appo's there. And quote, it wasn't and Appo's said cruelly. It was simply true, and we both let it sit in the room without either of us rushing to soften it, which felt strangely like the most honest conversation we and Appo's had in years. Over dinner, he told me about the small consulting practice he and Appos D started after Sterling Regional let him go. Nothing glamorous, mostly helping local nonprofits with their financial reporting, work that paid a fraction of what he used to make. He told me without my asking that he and Appos D started seeing a therapist, a man in his 60s who specialized, as it happened, in adult children untangling their relationships with aging parents. End quote. He asked me once why I thought you and Appos D let it get as far as it did, end quote. Daniel said, pushing food around his plate. End quote. The guardianship petition, I mean. Why you didn't end Appos T just stop it early, tell me the truth the first month, save us both a year of misery. End quote. End quote. What did you tell him? End quote. End quote. I told him I didn't end Appos T no. I still don't end Appos T really. End quote. He looked up at me. End quote. Do you regret it? Letting it go that far? End quote. I thought about the question honestly before I answered it, the way I and Appos D learned over the last several years to actually sit inside hard questions instead of rushing past them. End quote. Some days, end quote, I said. End quote. There were nights on Larkspur Avenue I lay awake wondering if I was being wise or just stubborn, dressed up as wisdom. But I don't and Appos T think a phone call in month one would have taught either of us anything true about who we actually were to each other. It would have just made the money disappear as a problem. It wouldn't and Appos T have made the reason you were willing to hurt me for it disappear. I needed to know that reason, Daniel. And so I think did you? End quote. He didn't and Appos T have an answer for that. He simply nodded slowly, and for the rest of that dinner we talked instead about ordinary things. His new business, Sophie and Appos S coursework, a leak in his apartment ceiling that reminded him, he said with a small, real laugh, of my old water stains on Larkspur. It has been slow since that dinner. It has been, more than once, disappointing, and there have been months I and Appos V wondered whether the distance between who he became and who I raised him to be is simply too far to close. But he has shown up consistently for 2 years running, without ever once asking me for anything, and last winter, unprompted, he mailed me an envelope. Inside was $20 folded into quarters. I know it doesn't in Appos T undo anything, the note said. I just wanted you to have it back. I think about that morning every single day. I and Appos am sorry it took me so long to understand what I actually took from you. That wasn't an Appos T money. I keep both bills now, the original and the returned one, in the same drawer. I haven't and Appos T decided yet what that means, or whether it means anything at all beyond a man trying slowly and perfectly to become someone his mother might one day fully trust again. Sophie and Appos S nursing school graduation was held on a bright Saturday in May, in an auditorium with terrible acoustics and folding chairs that squeaked every time 300 families shifted in their seats. I sat in the second row between Grace and Marcus, both of whom Sophie had insisted, over my mild protest that it might be, end quote, too much, end quote, be given seats of honor alongside family. End quote. They and Appos not just your friends, grandma, end quote. She and Appos D said, rolling her eyes at me the way only a 22-year-old can roll her eyes at someone she adores. End quote. They and Appos basically why I still have a family worth graduating in front of. They and Appos sitting up front. End quote. Daniel sat on my other side in a jacket that fit him properly again, clapping so hard for his daughter and Appos S name that his hands were pink by the time she crossed the stage. When they called her name, Sophie Voss, Bachelor of Science in Nursing Geriatric Care Specialization, she found our row in the crowd before she found the dean and Appos S outstretched hand, and she pointed, unmistakably, directly at me. Afterward, in the parking lot, she pressed something small and folded into my palm. A check, I realized before I and Appos D even opened it, for $200, her first paycheck stub still clipped to the corn. End quote. I don't and Appos T need this, sweetheart, end quote, I said, trying to hand it back. End quote. Save it. You and Appos just starting out. End quote. End quote. It and Appos S not for you to keep, end quote, Sophie said. End quote. It and Appos S for the fund. My first donation. I want it to be the first thing I ever do with my own money, before rent, before anything. I looked it up, that and Appos S roughly what Ruth Alvarez and Appos S granddaughter said the intake consultation would, and Appos V cost if you and Oppos, D charged her like anyone else does and quote, she closed my fingers around the check with both of her hands, the same gesture I realized with a small shock that I used to make with hers when she was small enough to still need help crossing a street. End quote. You taught me that money and Oppos, S not really about what it buys, Grandma. It and Oppos, S about what you and Oppos, willing to do with it when nobody in Oppos, S forcing you to. I wanted my first check to prove I actually learned that, and not just from watching you talk about it. From watching you live it. And quote. I did not cry at the guardianship hearing. I did not cry at the gala, or in the courtroom, or even alone at my kitchen table the night the sanctions order came down against my son. I cried in that parking lot, holding a folded $200 check from my granddaughter, surrounded by the small, strange, hard-won family I actually had left. Not the one $20 had once tried to define me out of, but the one patience and truth and a great deal of quiet stubbornness had built instead. I Don and Oppos T need him to. That and Oppos, S the part one understand now that I didn't and Oppos, T understand standing on that porch 10 years ago. I was never actually poor, not for one single day of this story, not even in the Motel 6, not even on Larkspur Avenue with water stains on the ceiling. I had a trust, yes, and a company and a fortune I never once had to spend to survive what my family did to me. But what actually got me through it wasn't an Oppos T the money at all. It was patience. It was Grace and Oppos, S steady friendship and Marcus and Oppos, S stubborn decency and a 17-year-old girl brave enough to whisper the truth from a school library when every adult around her had chosen silence instead. Money was simply the thing that let the truth, when it finally arrive on my own terms, in a room full of gold light, instead of a courtroom full of strangers deciding who I was allowed to be. I think that and Oppos, S the real inheritance I want to leave behind, more than any wing with my name carved into the wall, more than any trust, more than any $20 bill returned 10 years too late. Not the wealth, the patience to wait until the truth was ready to stand on its own, and the quiet certainty the whole time that it eventually would. Some evenings when the garden and Oppos, S put to bed and the house is quiet, I take that nightstand drawer out and set both $20 bills side by side on the kitchen table, the original, soft and worn from 10 years of folding and unfolding, and the one Daniel mailed back, still crisp at the edges, barely handled at all. I Don and Oppos T do it out of bitterness anymore. I do it the way you might visit an old scar, just to remind your fingers of the shape of what healed. I think if I and Oppos am honest that and Oppos, S the truest ending I can give you. Not a scene of triumph, though there was one of those in a ballroom full of gold light. Not a scene of punishment, though there was some of that too in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet. Just an old woman at her own kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday holding two versions of the same $20, the one that was taken from her when everyone assumed she had nothing left to lose, and the one that came back slowly and perfectly, once her son finally understood exactly how much he and Oppos D been wrong. I keep the roses blooming out front, the ones I dug up from the old yard before the new owners tore out the rest. Sophie calls at 4:00 and Oppos clock on Sundays without fail. Odette and Oppos S coffee gets stronger every year, and I let her keep making it that way, because some things are worth more for staying exactly as they and Oppos V always been. And somewhere in a filing cabinet at Grace and Oppos S office behind 2 generations of careful legal paper, the box Walter and I built all those years ago still stands. Not hidden anymore, not a wall between me and the people I love, but simply what it always should have been. A place to keep what mattered until I was finally ready to decide, entirely on my own terms, who deserved to know.